Dying Light 1 is one of, if not the best zombie game of all time. All of its elements, when looked at separately, are simple and concise, but through this simplicity, and when these elements come together, it provides a very consistent and enjoyable experience with a lot of depth. This game single-handedly raised the bar for standards on what constitutes a good zombie game, and in doing so it set the bar quite high for expectations on Dying Light 2. These expectations were not met in the slightest. Dying Light 2 is at the most basic level Dying Light 1 but with less features and polish. This can be seen in every single aspect of the game, from the combat to the parkour, and especially so in the story. So to show my love and appreciation for Dying Light 1, whilst also showing my distaste for its successor, I'm going to compare the two games in the elements where they differ most. These elements are both of the game's stories, the environments with which the two games take place in and how immersive and expansive they are in terms of exploration, how the combat ties in with the story and how it deteriorated in the second installment, zombie behaviours and the day and night system, the level of technical polish in both the games, and how good the game's Easter eggs are. There will likely be other elements that will be mentioned in passing, however these are the elements I will be focusing on within this video. With that being said, let's compare Dying Light 1 to Dying Light 2. Considering the fact that most zombie games aren't particularly known for their stories, the tale that is told within Dying Light 1 is rather phenomenal. The story follows Kyle Crane, an undercover agent for the Global Relief Effort, or the GRE, being sent into the fictional Middle Eastern city of Haran to track down a rogue political figure named Kadir Raya Suleiman, who has acquired a file that at first is believed to hold the cure to the zombie virus outbreak that has occurred within the city. Crane ends up becoming infected, but is rescued by Jade Aldemir, who takes him to the tower where the majority of Haran's survivors are holed up. Once there, she gets him treated with a medicine called antizin to slow the progress of the infection and mitigate its effects. From this point forward, Crane starts to continuously question his allegiance to the GRE as they begin to order him to carry out a series of unethical tasks, such as burning an airdrop of antizin to force the tower to negotiate with Rias, so the GRE can confirm his identity. This allegiance continues to be eroded throughout the game as Crane interacts more with Rias, as he is the one who clues Crane in on the GRE's intention to weaponize the virus and cover it up by firebombing the entire city while lying about there being no survivors. In all instances, Crane becomes more and more disgruntled with them and begins to work covertly against them until the end of the game. When he kills Rias and acquires the file, he makes his intentions known, tells the GRE to do one, and dedicates his efforts instead to helping the survivors survive and develop a cure. It's incredibly gripping and keeps you on the edge of your seat, especially considering the game's emphasis on parkour. Parkour's story significance comes from the fact that Haran was going to be home to something akin to the Olympic Games, and all the survivors had survived as long as they had because Brecken, a parkour instructor, and Jade, who is a professional kickboxer, taught them how to both avoid and fight off the infected. These skills are also passed on to Crane, who uses them throughout the game in order to survive. In order to fully understand the story of Dying Light 2, Dying Light 1's DLC The Following needs to be addressed. The story within this DLC revolves around Crane learning from a survivor about a supposed cure for the virus, and with the tower running out of antizin due to the GRE stopping airdrops and Dr. Camden's efforts to producing a cure still unsuccessful, he ventures out to the countryside to investigate this supposed immunity. He ends up coming across survivors who are part of a cult called the Children of the Sun, who worship the Mother, the supposed source of this immunity. Crane assists the survivors to gain their trust until a high-ranking member of the cult approaches Crane and admits to him that the source of the immunity is actually through an elixir they discovered, but much like antizin, it only suppresses the infection instead of curing it. The member reveals also that they are working on a more permanent cure and promise that in exchange for his help, Crane can have it to take back to Haran. The member then tasks Crane to seek out a man named Attila, who is working on an important project for the mother. Attila tells Crane of the prophecy of the children of the sun, that a chosen one will rise up and cure the infection, and reveals the identity of the mother to be a woman named Jasmine, the wife of a local military colonel who was involved in the experiments that caused the outbreak in the first place, but became infected. Before he died, he told Attila a code, which Attila then relays to Crane. Attila then commits suicide in hopes to invoke the prophecy, but fails. Crane then discovers that Rias's men have infiltrated the countryside and plan to attack the mother in a nearby dam. He goes to assist, only to find everyone dead. When he enters the dam, he discovers that the mother is in fact a sentient volatile. She reveals the dam was a secret military facility that held a special chemical substance. But this substance, rather than curing the infection, slowly turned people into sentient volatiles. During the day, the volatiles retain their sentience, but in the night, they become ravenous monsters. The mother tells Crane that the only way to stop the infection is to summon the god of the sun to purify the land, sacrificing everybody in Haran in the process. Crane can either defy the mother or side with her. If Crane listens to the mother, she leads him to a nuclear warhead that was originally meant as a failsafe to contain the outbreak. Crane inputs the code Attila gave him, which activates the warhead, presumably destroying all of Haran, killing all of the survivors and the infected, and taking the virus with them. Defying her makes her attack Crane, and she forces the elixir down his throat. Once she is defeated, Crane takes what's left of the elixir and attempts to leave the dam. He suffers several blackouts until he eventually makes it out into a densely populated area. He sees a mother and child staring back at him, screaming in terror, to which he attempts to calm them but sees from his hand that he's turned into a sentient volatile. As night approaches, he lets out the Night Hunter's roar, and it's presumed he spreads the infection outside of the quarantine zone. During the events of the following, Spike, one of the quartermasters within Haran's survivor groups and eventually in the tower, manages to help the survivors escape Haran. The following story is much shorter and simpler than the main game, but it's also very interesting, and the two branching paths at the end made for an interesting choice. Sacrifice everyone in the quarantine zone to protect the rest of the population, or attempt to nab the cure in the hopes that you can still save your friends. There was immense debate when Dying Light 2 was announced over which ending would be canonized. Neither option ended up as canon, and instead, they went with this. Dying Light 2 opens mentioning everyone in Haran died, which is immediately stupid because you begin the game with Spike, and the GRE managed to develop a vaccine for the Haran virus, effectively ending the pandemic. The only problem is they continued to experiment with the virus despite saying they weren't, and a second outbreak occurred. This strain of the virus was even more deadly than the Haran virus due to the fact that antizin and the vaccine failed to stop it. The only thing that could prevent the infection spreading was ultraviolet light, but it was not a cure. The entire world eventually succumbed to the virus, and practically the entire world's population was dead, besides a handful of scattered settlements. Aiden, the main character, is a pilgrim who ventured between settlements but came to Villador, one of the largest settlements, to find his lost sister Mia. The entire plot of this game revolves around you basically interacting between three factions: the militaristic peacekeepers, the independent survivors, and the violent renegades. I cannot remember for the life of me who leads any of the factions you can side with, but it isn't really important anyway. The only important thing to remember is the big bad of the game is a man named Vincent Waltz, who experimented on Aiden and Mia when they were children. Aiden confronts Waltz on multiple occasions throughout the story, and he demonstrates superhuman abilities as a result of inhibitors, the new antizin of the game. Inhibitors basically stop the infection from spreading, but also miraculously give you superhuman abilities when you need them most. Waltz is housing Mia in a place called X13, which is the location Aiden and her were experimented on. It's here where Waltz reveals that Mia is his daughter, who he's been attempting to save from the infection. Aiden wants to save Villador from being blown up by missiles in X13, but shutting down the missile launch requires shutting down X13 entirely, which is what is keeping Mia alive. Eventually, Aiden dukes it out with Waltz, and then you have to make a choice. Save Mia and leave Lawan, the forgettable side protagonist that appears halfway into the game, or save Lawan and let the missiles blow up Villador. In either case, Mia dies anyway, so the entire story is literally pointless, and Aiden just goes and leaves Villador either way because he's infected. It's completely bewildering and makes you question why you even wasted your time. None of the events in the story have any stakes or make any sense, like how the VNC tower in the city section was made out to be this relentlessly infested volatile nest with types of infected we've never even seen before, yet it ends up being a piece of cake. You don't even see any new infected, or even fight that many, and once you reach the top of the tower, Lawan miraculously appears, having apparently scaled the entire tower by herself, without a single scratch, in quite literally 1/8 the time it takes the player to scale it. Compared to Dying Light 1, Dying Light 2's story is a joke. Dying Light 1's story is one of the best zombie game stories I have ever played. A lot of the rendition for the story here for the first game is quite literally from memory. Dying Light 2's story is memorable, but purely because of how ridiculously contradictory it is, and how effortlessly it screws up a setup and payoff. Searching for Mia is one of the most boring plot lines I've ever had to sit through in a video game, and it makes Dying Light 2 torturous to play through. Even when I looked up the plot for the game, it mentions that regardless of which faction you side with in the game, it doesn't matter at all, because the story will still play out in exactly the same 3 to 4 ways, only if you choose a certain ending, one faction will take over the entire city. The game in no way gives you any reason to feel connected with the characters around you, and most of them barely even have a say in the end of the game anyway. In Dying Light 1, most of the characters you meet are essential to the story and Crane's survival in the quarantine zone. At every corner, the characters you meet in the game have their survival repeatedly threatened by Riot and the GRE, and it does a good job of making you care for the people in the tower who are just trying to survive. And Crane, you end up becoming their most valuable asset to ensure their survival. Crane's support for the people is born out of seeing them being wronged by the powers that be, and he decides to help these people out of the goodness of his heart. Aiden in Dying Light 2 does everything for his own gain, which makes me very disconnected from not only him, but also every character around him, as once Aiden got what he needed, I knew those characters would become irrelevant. He's not essential at all to anybody's survival, and is driven only by a selfish desire to get information on his sister. Not to forget, the continuity between Dying Light 1 and Dying Light 2 is nonsensical. The reason the infection should have spread outside of the Haran quarantine zone is due to Crane. They even mention him in the game itself. They don't mention anything about a nuke going off, and if they did, there's absolutely no way you can convince me Spike, of all people, survived. Crane should be the only reason the virus got out of Haran, yet they completely disregard this plot point and instead drone it down to the GRE screwed up again. They could have very easily followed Crane's infection plot point and made something exceptionally cool out of it, like having us make a choice to assist Crane in exposing the GRE and risk trusting a volatile creature that could potentially spread the infection once more, or fight him to prevent that from ever happening again, but in doing so you're killing killing a sentient life form who has good intentions when he's in control of himself. That sounds like a much more engaging and thought-provoking story than the drivel that actually exists within Dying Light 2. Perhaps a DLC like The Following but for Dying Light 2 might save its tarnished reputation, but as of current, Dying Light 1's story is immensely superior compared to Dying Light 2's utterly shambolic events. The structure of the environments within Dying Light 1 and 2 differ in a way that majorly favours Dying Light 1. Granted, Dying Light 1's interiors don't feature any special mechanics related to the zombies, but where they win out over Dying Light 2's is in the level of detail. There are so many different furnishings, trinkets, objects, posters, and general clutter within these interior spaces that add a massive level of depth in the immersion that Dying Light 2 just does not seem to replicate. A lot of the interiors in Dying Light 2 feel like wide open, empty rooms simply existing to house infected. I get that the devs had to design them somewhat differently to accommodate for the fact they wanted to incentivize using stealth to not alert sleeping zombies, but it seems they sacrificed some level of detail in order to achieve this. Dying Light 2 does give interior spaces an incentive to be explored though, as many of them tend to be marked as dangerous spaces, but with the reward of much greater loot, though this is done in an immersion-breaking way. In Dying Light 1 there was no special mechanics relating to indoor spaces, however they naturally incentivized exploration of interior spaces, as they tended to be the locations with the most loot in them. There was no need for objective markers, you just saw a big pharmacy sign above the shop and knew you'd likely find medical supplies within. Whether or not it was clear of infected was down to you to find out. In this sense, Dying Light 1's interiors are much more immersive compared to the second game. One thing that I noticed between the two games is how they differ in handling invisible walls and out-of-bounds areas. Dying Light 1 does a good job of this, using a mix of walls with barbed wire at the top, tall unclimbable quarantine walls, caved-in tunnels, collapsed bridges, and steep hills. Dying Light 2's answer to invisible walls is instead a death barrier, showing a vast expanse of land covered in dangerous chemicals that rapidly speed up the rate of infection. Upon my first viewing of this, I wondered if there was a hazmat suit or something that allowed for the exploration of these areas that might potentially house some powerful enemies but also some unique loot, only to eventually complete the game and realize that its sole purpose is to be a death barrier. It disappointed me immensely, especially considering you can actually explore small isolated areas beyond these chemicals, but house little more than some loot components. At least in Dying Light 1 they're explainable, and some of these areas even have mini dungeons with their own mini backstories and objectives for you to complete, rewarding your exploration. Dying Light 2 kinda has these, with the shops and the quarantine zones, but they're far less unique and much more repetitive and boring. Lastly, Dying Light 1's atmospheric sounds are far better than Dying Light 2's. Occasionally in Dying Light 1 you'll hear metallic weapons being dropped, pebbles or rubble crumbling, distant zombie sounds, and if you make loud noises, you hear zombies getting mad and breaking down doors and bursting from the ground to come get you. It's extremely horrifying. I didn't notice this as much with Dying Light 2. It misses a lot of small details compared to Dying Light 1's sounds, which immersed you so effortlessly. The world around you feels alive and active in Dying Light 1, but in Dying Light 2, you sometimes feel like the only person running around doing anything. The combat mechanically doesn't change much between the two games. What does change is its story significance and some nuances to its depth. In Dying Light 1, combat and parkour were combined to make Crane a deadly combatant, even if unarmed. This is because most of the skills tended to unlock new parkour moves, new combat moves, link parkour to combat, for example the infamous dropkick, and make you more efficient with your stamina or parkouring speed. All of this makes sense, considering the backdrop of the game, how the Olympics were being held in Haran, and how the people you meet are former athletes or coaches. Considering how Brecken is a parkour instructor, it makes sense how Crane progressively gains the abilities he does in parkour, and because Jade is a professional kickboxer, it makes sense how Crane learns his skills in unarmed combat. In Dying Light 2, you gain perks through inhibitors, and these can go in either skill tree, but it makes zero sense how Aiden gains these abilities. At a stretch, you could say that the independent survivors taught him how to parkour, and the militaristic peacekeepers taught him how to fight, but they don't offer this help to you, nor is there any evidence of this. And you don't learn new skills by doing parkour or combat, unlike in the first game. They come from inhibitors instead, which makes no semblance of sense story-wise. Additionally, Dying Light 2's combat system is missing ragdoll physics and the skeleton system from Dying Light 1, making it very one-dimensional. Instead of being able to creatively handle your enemies in whichever way you see fit, Dying Light 2's mechanics are very cut and dry. Instead of redirecting an enemy into a ragdolled position wherein anything could happen, they play out an animation before getting back to their feet. In Dying Light 1, you could throw a zombie into a wall, potentially breaking their arm, which made it so they couldn't grab you. While it's down on the floor, you could break the zombie's legs so it couldn't get back up. From there, you've completely disabled the zombie from being a threat to you even though it's still alive. There's no such nuance like this in Dying Light 2. You have to kill an enemy to prevent it from being a threat to you. Granted, the physics mechanics still kick in some places in Dying Light 2, but it's much more rare and makes the combat pretty dull and unsatisfying at times. Dying Light 1's combat system is far better in this regard. Quick note, since revisiting Dying Light 2, they have re-implemented the X-ray system from the previous game, but it serves more as a satisfying visual rather than providing any mechanical purpose like it did in the first game. This point of re-implementing previous mechanics present in the first game will be expanded upon later, so keep it in mind. The way zombies behave between the games is drastically different, even if it may not look like it at first. The day and night systems also function extremely different too. In Dying Light 1, zombies during the daytime tended to be much less aggressive and lethargic. Virals, people who recently turned into zombies, were the only real threat during the daytime, as many other larger zombies could be easily avoided. Virals are much faster and more aggressive and fight more like feral humans. They can even climb and chase Crane across buildings. But the only time you have to worry about them is if you make an exceptionally loud sound, such as an explosion or gunshot. At night, however, volatiles come out, and they are much stronger and faster than virals, with some even being able to spit acid. Additionally, regular zombies will become much more aggressive and evolve into viral-like zombies if left unchecked. This makes night far more dangerous, however, you get rewarded doubly as much. If you're spotted by a volatile, chase mode initiates, and they'll hunt you down until they lose sight of you. If that happens, they will enter search mode in an attempt to find you. If they don't find out where you are, their alert level resets. The higher their alert level, the more volatiles will chase you down, and the more aggressive the normal zombies become, but the more you're rewarded. Volatile's only weakness is ultraviolet light, and so using an ultraviolet flashlight or ultraviolet traps enables you to have a chance to slow down your pursuers. Safe zones tend to be lit with ultraviolet light, so making it 2-1 will prevent volatiles from getting to you. It's a simple system, but it's very effective, and makes travelling at night exceptionally terrifying. Dying Light 2's zombie behaviour is much more strange. Volatiles tend to be found only inside quarantine zones or shops during the day. They aren't found inside any other buildings except those locations. At night, however, they disappear altogether and don't appear unless you reach alert level 3 in a chase. So what patrols the streets? Howlers. Their only purpose is to scream when they spot you to get virals to chase you. It makes night far less scary because the actual apex threats aren't patrolling the streets, and it's really easy to avoid these enemies because they only ever appear on the streets and nowhere else. A lot more infected show up in the streets alongside the Howlers though, making it so that the safest traversal method is limited to the rooftops only. This does mean though that many interiors are much safer to explore. Nighttime in Dying Light 1 feels much more threatening compared to Dying Light 2 because volatiles are a continuous, omnipresent threat during this time, and it's difficult to avoid them. Even if you're spotted by a zombie that's transforming into a viral, volatiles will soon follow. They're a threat right from the get-go compared to Dying Light 2, where they only become a threat if you reach chase level 3. Dying Light 2 tries to artificially make night scary again by adding in the fact that your infection timer ticks down in the dark. However, by the midway point in the game, this ends up becoming a non-issue, because the more inhibitors you find, the longer you can survive at night. Once this added pressure is alleviated, nighttime becomes a lot less scary, and it practically gives you a choice in whether you want to face the hardest enemies in the game or not. In Dying Light 1, you had no choice. Once night hit, you will encounter volatiles, one way or another. Sure, you could still skip night in the first game by using a bed, but you had to get to one first, and if you were not careful enough, you might end up out at night, and at that point the gloves came off. This is why Dying Light 1's nighttime is far scarier than Dying Light 2's, and why it wins over the second game in this category. Another note here, if you go to the Steam page for Dying Light 2 and look at their development roadmap, they intend on re-implementing roaming volatiles during the night into the game. This only further validates my point that people thought that nighttime in Dying Light 2 was far less scary and intimidating than it was in Dying Light 1. Easter eggs in the Dying Light games are probably the best I've ever seen in a video game. This is because the majority of the Easter eggs always reward the player for finding them with equipment or a weapon of some kind. One of my favourites is the EXP Caliber, which is a ridiculously powerful sword that, while it doesn't do any damage, launches zombies at high speeds, which typically kills them wherever they land, thanks to the physics and X-ray system. Other notable weapons are the Sick Bomb, which when detonated spins zombies around in a Catherine wheel-like style, and the Pizer suit, which enables you to glide along the air. There are plenty of fun Easter egg weapons in Dying Light 1, and all of them are exceptionally fun to use. Dying Light 2 also has quite a few Easter egg weapons, however, none of them are weapons, like the EXP Caliber sword. Some examples include the Force Choke from Star Wars, finger guns, and a charm that refills the durability of any weapon it's attached to. The trouble is, all of them, besides the charm, are pieces of equipment that take massive amounts of components to make, and only last for a couple uses. Being able to use them regularly is impossible due to their crafting cost, and they're all not really that effective at killing zombies in creative ways. Sure, some Easter egg weapons in Dying Light 1 required you to craft them over and over, but they didn't have an exceptionally high cost to create them. This alone makes Dying Light 1's Easter egg weapons superior compared to Dying Light 2's lineup, and they're also far more fun to use. Another quick note: the charm that repairs your items has been recently updated to now require you to have a massive amount of mutagen samples to be able to repair your items. Sure, it was kind of broken that you could infinitely repair your weapon without any cost, but it's an Easter egg charm, for God's sake. Why was this necessary? It just further shows how unfun the Easter egg items are in the second game compared to the first. This section was not in the original draft for this script, and that was because I wrote the entirety of the first draft before getting the gameplay. I wanted to compare my experience returning to the game to what I had written down from memory. Dying Light 1 was precisely as I remembered it. It ran smoothly, concisely, and had barely any hiccups or errors. Dying Light 2, however, was disgusting. My PC is running the game on a Nvidia 1080 Ti on mostly maxed out settings, and the FPS fluctuated massively, from 90 FPS all the way down to 50 FPS. The game is horrifically optimized, and even someone using a 4070 Ti only managed around 120 FPS on max settings, which also fluctuated massively. On Dying Light 1, I was getting above 144 FPS consistently, and the 4070 Ti was achieving 300 FPS constantly. That's the level of difference between the optimization of both games on max settings. And that's not even mentioning what was happening with the online co-op. I played Dying Light 1 with a friend for 3 hours straight, with absolutely no technical glitches whatsoever. In Dying Light 2, my co-op partner, I kid you not, turned invisible. He was still fighting zombies, but he was completely invisible. Shortly after he turned invisible, the game then abruptly crashed for no apparent reason. This is why this section of the video now exists, due to this experience. You can play Dying Light 1 for 3 hours straight and encounter absolutely no issues whatsoever, but play Dying Light 2 for 16 minutes and the game kills itself. It is absolutely unforgivable, especially considering the game has been out for a year now. It is unacceptable. In conclusion, Dying Light 1 is superior in many ways to Dying Light 2. The second game is missing so much finer detail and polish to the point where it can only be considered a direct downgrade from the first game. All you have to do to really see the difference is look at the Steam page's reviews for both games. It's perfectly reasonable to say Dying Light 1 was a masterpiece of a game in practically every aspect, and so any attempt to alter the original was inevitably going to form cracks in the armour. Dying Light 2 lacks a level of polish and nuance that Dying Light 1 already had. It was doomed from the start to be worse in one way or another to Dying Light 1, and the points brought up in this video evidences that. From the story and characters, to the environment and ambience, to even the mechanics and combat, Dying Light 2 just could not match the spectacular perfection of Dying Light 1. Nice work making it to the end of the video. I'm sure I may have missed some points out, but if I did, be sure to comment them down below. If you want to support the channel in any way possible, I highly recommend my newly set up Patreon. But it also helps me out just as much when you like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you just did, then I will likely see you in the next video. Ciao!